Okay, so let's begin by acknowledging country. The most important thing to do first. My name's Jennifer Newman. I'm Wiradjuri. I'm far from home. I'm sitting on Wongal country this afternoon. I'm sitting on Wongal country not because Wongal people invited me here or asked me to come and stay here. I brought my own self here. And so to acknowledge Wongal country is to say thank you to the ancestors and the spirit of Wongal that still inhabits this land that I occupy here. And it's also to make an undertaking to care for Wongal country in the same way as I would care for my Wiradjuri country further west. Acknowledging country this afternoon, I look across the screen and I see all of the people who've come together, and I know that you're on many different countries, and I know that we're all making our tracks and weaving our stories together as we cross our different countries. So I want to acknowledge also all of the places that each of us is sitting this afternoon, and to think about the history and culture that is deep in the earth and up in the sky, and that is all around us, that we appreciate in all of the places that we live and work. My old people walk with me and remind me to walk with care and respect on this good country, and my old people say hello to your old people who are walking with you today as well and helping you live a good life. I particularly like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've come this afternoon, who perhaps are living on country or perhaps are far from home, but who nevertheless carry country in their hearts. And in acknowledging country this afternoon, I think also that I want to acknowledge that country needs people and people needs country. We make each other in different ways, in physical ways, in spiritual ways, in aesthetic ways. And coming together for Anne Maree's book launch this afternoon, I'm reminded that not every Aboriginal person or Torres Strait Islander person is able to be on country because of the history of a removal of children, because we've been taken from country and not been able to carry with us those deep connections. But I'm reminded of something that Tony Birch wrote a couple of years ago when he was thinking about working with stolen generation members, and he did say that they always have a story to tell, which might be about places, about country that they've not seen in their lifetime, but is nevertheless deep in their hearts. And so I'm thankful for Tony Birch to remind me to always think about those threads of connection that remain with us. And as we think about stolen generations history, we can also take a moment to think about the way country can always remind us that we can belong somewhere, but we can also sit somewhere in peace and in care, because if people love country, country will love us back. So we're here this afternoon for the very exciting event of a book launch, which I think is one of the great things in the world. I'm so excited about this. So we should start with some housekeeping. And these days we're all so cool with living in Zoom that we've probably forgotten about even having to flick our microphones off at the moment. But I'll just remind you to keep your microphone off for the moment. As we move through this afternoon, we've got some speakers this afternoon, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions and discussion. So please keep your microphone mute until such time as you might be invited to ask a question. You might have noticed that the meeting is being recorded, and if you don't want to be recorded, you should turn your camera off, so that you're not visible to the camera. I also want to let you know that there is some information that we'll put up as we go along this afternoon. This book launch has been run this afternoon to receive some donations and to contribute to the great work of the Healing Foundation. And Jo's with us this afternoon, and she's going to have a talk to us in a little while as well. So as we go along this afternoon, we'll put up some information about how to make donations and how to contribute to the great work of healing people and healing history that the Healing Foundation does. We'll also put some information up as we go along about how to obtain a copy of the book. There are a number of different ways that you can do that. So we'll keep that information rolling through this afternoon as we move through our speakers. And I think that that's probably about all of the housekeeping we need to take care of at the moment. So it's probably time for me to do one of the very great joys of being a host of a book launch, and that's to introduce an author. Introduce Anne Maree, who I'm very proud to have known through many years of connection to UTS and beyond. And just to start off by expressing my excitement at seeing this important work appear in a book form. Anne Maree is a non-Indigenous Australian, settler Australian's work supporting Aboriginal social justice for more than 25 years. You know, in 1993, she developed the UTS's first university-wide Aboriginal employment strategy. And that dates back to my early years at UTS, so that's pretty exciting. In 1998, when she was the director of the UTS Equity and Diversity Unit, she co-authored the university's reconciliation statement. And I'm pretty proud to say I was part of that with Anne Maree too. So our stories are weaving together over time. And that reconciliation statement was one of the first of its kind in universities around Australia. In 2008, Anne Maree moved to the UK, where she was working as a researcher for the Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics. And that's where she completed her Masters in Human Rights with distinction. And that's where she wrote her thesis on gender and the Bringing Them Home inquiry. Back in 2012, she started researching for her PhD dissertation, Untold Suffering, Motherhood and the Stolen Generations. And she did that work under the supervision and guidance of Professor Heather Goodall, who I'm also very pleased to have known for so many years. Since completing a PhD in 2016, Anne Maree's worked as a researcher and a sessional academic at UTS. She's been very passionate about truth-telling and history, and about teaching Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people about history and Aboriginal history, and having a particular focus on the strategies to engage non-Indigenous people, to hear Aboriginal perspectives. And she's also very recently been an invited contributor to the Elder Encyclopedia of Human Rights, writing an encyclopedia entry on mothers' rights. This is the first time that this topic has been included in this internationally prestigious publication. Stolen Motherhood, Aboriginal Mothers and Child Removal in the Stolen Generations Era is Anne Maree's first publication, her first book. Not her first publication, but it's her first book. And I'm so excited to be here today to listen to Anne Maree speak about her work. Thanks very much, Anne Maree.
Thanks so much, Jen. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking today on the lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, particularly any elders in attendance here today, as well as all Indigenous attendees whose families have been impacted by child removal policies and practices. Thanks very much for those kind introductory words, Jen, and I couldn't imagine having this event without you, and I'm so honoured and proud to have you here, as well as so many dear friends, colleagues, students and other people who've come along today to hear about my research into motherhood and the stolen generations. As Jen has mentioned, I first began working on Aboriginal issues back in 1993, so it's been nearly a 30-year journey for me. And as those of you who are old enough to remember will recall, the 1990s were dubbed the decade of reconciliation, and by 1996 the Bringing Them Home inquiry was underway. Like many non-Indigenous Australians, I was horrified to hear the traumatic stories told by members of the stolen generations in their testimony at the Bringing Them Home inquiry. And I was equally horrified in 1997 by the Howard government's refusal to accept the inquiry's findings. I also vividly remember the destructive public debate at the time, again led by John Howard, who argued that Australians today were not responsible for the actions of the past, and that in any case, child removals were undertaken in keeping with the standards of the day and were done in the best interests of those who were removed. After 15 years working in equity and diversity and supporting the university's Aboriginal employment and reconciliation initiatives, I moved to London in 2008 and studied human rights and political reconciliation at the London School of Economics. In the course of my research into the Bringing Them Home inquiry, I was struck by the absence of participation of Aboriginal parents at the inquiry. I wondered what had happened to these mothers and why they felt unable to speak about their experiences, even at a human rights inquiry investigating the issue of Aboriginal child removal. These questions led to my PhD research and to this book, which was born from my desire to understand the reasons contributing to the resounding silence of Aboriginal mothers at the inquiry and beyond, and to reflect critically on human rights processes based on truth-telling. I didn't just decide to start investigating this topic. I first met with a number of senior Indigenous staff at UTS, both in my faculty and across the university, including Auntie Joan Tranter, the Indigenous elder in residence, who is a dear friend of mine and who first suggested the term the stolen mums to me. I'm really sorry that Auntie Joan can't be here with us tonight. Zoom's a bit too much for her, but I know she's here in spirit and we're recording it so that she can watch it later. So love and a big shout out to Auntie Joan. I also contacted all of the major organisations working with stolen generation survivors: Link-Up New South Wales, the Healing Foundation, Reconciliation Australia, the Stolen Generations Alliance and the National Sorry Day Committee, to tell them about my proposed research and to invite their feedback, questions and input. I had responses from all of these organisations except for the National Sorry Day Committee, and I changed my research approach based on feedback I received from the Stolen Generations Alliance, who said that members of the stolen generations were experiencing research fatigue and who also expressed concerns about me speaking directly to Aboriginal mothers. I changed my plan, which was originally to undertake all of the interviews myself, and I instead drew primarily on the National Library of Australia's Bringing Them Home Oral History Archive. I wanted to maintain the highest ethical standards about using people's stories in my work. So all of the content in my book was either already available in the public domain, or I sought and received individual permission from people to include their content. My aim was not to fill the silence or to speak on behalf of Aboriginal mothers, but to find and amplify their voices, as well as to understand the impact of white laws, policies and prejudice which had led to child removals in the stolen generations era. And it's that aspect in particular that I think all non-Indigenous Australians should be aware of and reflect on. The mothers and their adult children who I spoke to were very supportive about my research and wanted their stories to be told so that others would understand what had happened to them. And I want to share just one of a number of messages of report I received from one of the interviewees who said, "As I was reading the manuscript you sent, tears just rolled down my cheeks. Although this happened to me over 60 plus years ago, the pain and hurt never goes away. It surfaces whenever I meet up with my 2 children who were removed. I just swallow my hurt in remembering those hurtful times and never say anything. I sometimes wonder if I will truly be able to put it all in the past. These stories must be told, as it is something I myself would not have been able to tell, as there is so much emotion attached to my story. Human rights is an interdisciplinary field, and my research drew on oral history accounts, the autobiographical writings of Aboriginal mothers, as well as those of white Australians involved in child removal, and an in-depth analysis of the laws, policies and practices that facilitated the removal of Aboriginal children in the stolen generations era. The voices and perspectives of Aboriginal people were my major source of information. However, when you research silence, it's very difficult to get behind that silence to find out what was actually going on. A particular challenge was that removed Aboriginal children are understandably seen as the major victims of child removal practices, so that when I began searching archives, such as the National Library of Australia's excellent Bringing Them Home Oral History collection, it was not possible to easily identify those interviews discussing mothers' experiences of child removal. I read and analysed 130 transcripts from the National Library's collection, searching for the voices of Aboriginal mothers. And I also drew on 4 in-depth interviews which I undertook myself. I read every piece of the extensive raft of so-called Aboriginal protection legislation which made reference to Aboriginal child removal and the restriction of Indigenous parental rights, and there was lots of it. I at times wondered whether white legislators in the 20th century did anything other than make laws about Aboriginal people. I looked at the impact of racial discrimination in restricting Aboriginal mothers' access to social security and family payments, drawing on the autobiographical accounts of Aboriginal mothers about the hardships this had caused to their families. A major part of my argument in this book is that we cannot understand the Stolen Generations era and the issues impacting on Aboriginal families without understanding the structural barriers to Aboriginal mothering at this time. The significant and widespread impediments impacting on Aboriginal mothers' capacity to care for and retain custody of their children during the Stolen Generations era included legal inequalities in terms of guardianship status and other parental rights relative to non-Indigenous parents, racial discrimination in access to social security benefits and family payments, the requirement that some Aboriginal mothers living on missions would work irrespective of their carers' responsibilities, leading to the removal and institutionalisation of their children, and as a consequence of living on a mission, government reserve, or in an Aboriginal camp on a remote property, the increased surveillance of Aboriginal families, resulting in the increased likelihood of state intervention in these families. These issues resulted in Aboriginal mothers being subject to discriminatory and inequitable constraints on their parenting and placed them at enhanced risk of having their children removed. Many of these issues were interrelated and combined to result in more Aboriginal families living in poverty, subject to state surveillance and intervention, and therefore at increased risk of child removal. As a non-Indigenous Australian myself, I thought it was vital that my research investigated the attitudes underpinning the actions of the white people who were involved in child removal at this time. I analysed interviews and other sources by and about the people involved in Aboriginal child removal, considering accounts from missionaries, patrol officers, police officers, medical staff, cottage mothers, adoptive and foster parents, Aboriginal affairs bureaucrats and child welfare workers. These accounts highlighted the lack of common ground between Aboriginal and white perspectives on Aboriginal child removal in the Stolen Generations era, and in particular, the wide divergence in views about the care provided by Aboriginal mothers. Aboriginal mothers of Stolen Generations children have been and continue to be characterised by many of these white perpetrators of child removal as neglectful and inadequate parents, and their characterisation as such is central to white claims that the removal of Aboriginal children was for their own good. This leads me to reflect briefly in closing on what I hope my book will achieve. I believe that considering the Stolen Generations era from the perspective of Aboriginal mothers leads to new insights and understanding of this confronting era in Australian history. It's been famously said that those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. We need to understand the historical demonisation of Aboriginal mothering in order to recognise how some of these attitudes continue to inform non-Indigenous views of Aboriginal parenting today. We need to understand and address the structural barriers to Indigenous parenting and move away from pathologising individual parents, instead providing real and meaningful support for Indigenous families and communities. In investigating Aboriginal mothers' unwillingness to speak about their experiences of child removal, my research identified limitations within the Bringing Them Home inquiry process. The difficulty for mothers to find a position from which they were willing and able to speak, constraints on mothers about speaking of experiences of sexual violation, the impact of shame, self-blame and the blame of others, cultural barriers to speaking about sorry business, the fear of damaging the fragile bonds which had been re-established with their now adult children, and the silencing impact of deep trauma. The book also identifies the circumstances that have enabled some Aboriginal mothers to speak about their experiences of child removal. Given the current emphasis on truth-telling in Australia, It is essential for human rights practitioners to ensure that truth-telling mechanisms are designed in an inclusive way that enable a wide variety of voices and perspectives to be shared. And I hope that my book will be a contribution to that discussion. What we learn about the complex experiences of some Aboriginal mothers of stolen generations' children highlights their struggles to make choices in the best interests of their children, despite the constrained options available to them. These powerful accounts from the mothers of removed children go to the very heart of key issues in the contested history of the stolen generations. To what extent did mothers consent to the removal of their children? What were the circumstances in which? What choices, indeed, were open to Aboriginal mothers who were in many cases themselves young single parents living in poverty, required to work to support their families, and denied the social security support and legal protections available to non-Indigenous parents? The limitations of human rights inquiries, with their constrained definitions of who is a rights holder and who has suffered damage, are also highlighted by the case of the mothers of the stolen generations. The damage of the original violation has spread widely beyond the individuals removed and their parents to their extended families and communities, and has also impacted across generations. This is challenging for a human rights inquiry grounded in notions of individual rights and freedoms to address. Finally, my book highlights that speaking about experiences of human rights violation, particularly that of child removal, requires empathetic listening. We need to respond to Aboriginal mothers' tales of loss and suffering with empathy and understanding rather than judgment and criticism, if we truly wish to heal the wounds of the past for Aboriginal mothers women whose motherhood was stolen from them. In the contentious debate that followed the publication of the Bringing Them Home report, it is possibly not surprising that Aboriginal mothers chose silence, but it is my hope that today we may finally be able to hear their stories.
Thanks very much, Anne Maree, and thank you very much for your care and your empathy and your commitment to history. As we said, today we're raising some funds, raising some donations amongst you for the Healing Foundation, and you can make those donations online as we spend time together this afternoon, or maybe later via the link that you see at the bottom of the screen here. And I would also like to mention, just before we move on, that you are able to obtain a copy of this book by, firstly, by making a donation of over $50 to the Healing Foundation. The first 50 of those donations will receive a copy from Anne Maree. So if you make a donation via the link at the bottom of the screen here and then email your receipt to Anne Maree, if you come in the first 50, she'll post a book out to you. Do let Anne Maree know in your email if you'd like her to personally inscribe your copy. The other way of obtaining a copy of the book is to purchase it. Before the 31st of December this year, the publisher's offering a 30% discount on copies, and there's a code up here. We can post this information in the chat as we go along as well. You can order it from the publisher's website. Now, unfortunately, disruptions to the US Postal Service mean that the deliveries of the hard copy of Anne Maree's book have been delayed to Australia at the moment, but you can order a digital copy. So the first 50 copies that Anne Maree has available, she has donated to raise proceeds for the Healing Foundation. Now, the only 50 copies in existence in Australia. So that's pretty exciting. And you can also follow up Anne Maree's research and her PhD thesis through the UTS library following this link. So after that information, and after listening to Anne Maree's beautiful words of care and compassion and good work, it's time to invite Professor Heidi Norman, another one of my very beautiful friends who I'm very proud to know for a long time. Professor Heidi Norman's the Associate Dean of Indigenous Research in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at UTS, and she's a leading researcher in the field of Aboriginal political history. Heidi's descended from the Gomeroi people in the northwest of the state. It's people just north of my own country. At the heart of Heidi's research is her support for Aboriginal people's rightful place in the nation, especially within political institutions, in society and in the economy as landholders. And Heidi's research also includes history of the Koori knockout, the annual Aboriginal Rugby League knockout. She's researched into the social and economic impact of mining on Gomeroi lands. And she's also engaged in a study of economic change over time and the relationship to Aboriginal lives in cities. In 2015, she published a political history of Aboriginal land rights in New South Wales called What Do We Want? A political history of Aboriginal land rights in New South Wales, which was the first ever study of land rights here in this state. Heidi's won many awards for both her research and teaching, including the National Teaching Excellence Award for her work in Indigenous Studies in 2016. And she was the inaugural Gough Whitlam Research Fellow in 2017 to 2018. And in 2018, Heidi was announced as a top 5 ABC humanities researcher. So if they're not great reasons to know and love this person, then her words that follow, I think, will bring us even closer to her. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you, my dear friend, for your acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the country where I am on Darkinjung lands at the minute. Your people, Jennifer, Aboriginal people with us today. And to you, Anne Maree, it's a great honour to be part of the launch of this very significant piece of work. So thank you. This book touches on the lives of stolen generations, an era spanning the 20th century when governments had unprecedented powers to remove Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their parents, mostly mothers, in truth, as Anne Maree documents, their kin and country. I acknowledge you. This book offers something of a challenge, and I think it's quite a radical challenge. Even before you have this book in your hands, the very provocation in the title, really, it's certainly, now having read this work, it's really posed some challenges in thinking about on a number of fronts. What Anne Maree does in this work, and I think it's really significant, is she challenges us to consider this period, the stolen generations period, and its long impact across multiple generations from a different perspective. As we've heard from Anne Maree, from the point of view of being a mother, of motherhood, or more specifically, the right to parent your child. We are asked to re-engage. Anne Maree challenges us to re-engage with the watershed human rights inquiry that culminated in the release of the 1997 Bringing Them Home report. And as Anne Maree indicated, an archive of interviews, oral histories, autobiographies, inquiries, and academic work. The challenge Anne Maree poses is to look, listen, and observe the voices of mothers. Now, why is this significant? In Stolen Motherhood, the title of Anne Maree's book, we are introduced to some startling facts. One of them in particular, that the Human Rights Inquiry and Bringing Them Home report did not include the testimony, the experiences of mothers. Noting there were 2 women who spoke of the loss of their children, but their evidence was mostly confined to their own experience as removed children. So this very challenge, it was acknowledged at the time of the launch of the report. So Commissioner Dodson acknowledged the silence of mothers. And he speculated that it was an oversight born of unspeakable grief. So Anne Maree takes up that silence, speculated to be unspeakable grief, and really in quite incredible detail considers how this the absence, we're reading across that archive and listening and looking for the voices of Aboriginal mothers. And what we start to hear is that there are wide circumstances that might be factors for not just the silence, but the words of Aboriginal mothers, but silence as perhaps an act of agency, silence as perhaps an act of, an inevitable act of actually not having the words to speak your grief. But more so, what Anne Maree maps out in this work is that there are circumstances of poverty, social disadvantage, racism and discrimination that Aboriginal women mothers faced in the stolen generations era. The agonising choices we are introduced to in relation to the autobiographies and archives, the oral histories and interviews that are contained in some of our leading collecting institutions. These agonising choices, such as surrendering one or more children in order to keep others. The reality of laws prohibiting marriage to white men and fathers. Laws that prohibited an Aboriginal woman from listing the paternity of the child, of a white father. The surveillance and control on missions and reserves, where working conditions on some missions and reserves forced women to leave their children behind or separated from them. Unequal access to parental payments. So this detailed map of the legislative, of the legal, policy, discursive realm point to the reality that what Aboriginal women faced at this period, in this period, was certainly the effects of immediate, the stealing of children, but also choiceless choice. Did I say that right, Anne Maree? Choiceless choice, right? So what choices did you have in this period? What choices were available to you in the context of all that Anne Maree has mapped out? There are a couple of other things I would like to highlight that I think are really significant about this work. Just two or three here. One is that, and this is a gentle critique of the Bringing Them Home report. And we know that the Bringing Them Home report has been criticised, but from far less engaging angles. So in Anne Maree's work, she highlights, I think, a lot of points, but two that I will pick up on. One is that Anne Maree suggests that the removal of Aboriginal children in Australia has been conceptualised under the term stolen generations, and this construction of the violation has operated to silence some Aboriginal mothers whose stories do not fit neatly within the dominant stolen generations narratives. So there has been a construction of a narrative about stolen generations that doesn't allow the complexity of the choiceless choices that Aboriginal women made at this time. Agonising choices, choices that broke you for the rest of your life. And what Anne Maree highlights is that the framing of the Bring Them Home report that looked at the experiences of children is quite a familiar feature of a human rights approach. So she says that this constrains that there are limitations in a human rights approach to thinking about stolen generations, because it constrains who is a rights holder and who has suffered a damage. But in doing this, what Anne Maree also suggests is that thinking about stolen generations from the point of view of mothers and motherhood and the right to parent also it exposes the limits of a human rights framework that looks at individuals, and rather to think about multiple generations, mother, daughter, and so on and so on. So where a human rights inquiries are grounded in notions of individual rights and freedoms, what this emphasis on mothers highlights is that it's not so much about individual rights and freedoms. It's a far more complex breach of of rights that encompasses multiple effects across generations of child removal. So just to conclude, we also hear that in these accounts, incredibly stark contrast between mothers and children and the white observers, missionaries, not observers, actors, missionaries and government bureaucrats who offer such incredibly divergent interpretations of given situations. So Anne Maree is wanting to highlight also that your context and your standpoint shapes how you document and make sense of a situation. And just finally, Anne Maree said to us when she just spoke then that she really wants to offer new insights and understandings, and she really does achieve that through this work. And she encourages us, even as I mentioned, before you have this book in your hand, before you start reading it, the very act of contemplating the stolen generations era through the lens of motherhood, the right to parent, shifts the debate quite considerably. And it leads us to think about what are choices? What choices do you have? What is the role of truth telling? Is there a big truth? Is a big truth possible? Is it possible to tell your truth? When you have a loss of voice in this process? I think Anne Maree speaks to the limits of speaking your truth, where instead silence sits. For others, the act of telling your story, such as in the many autobiographies that we are introduced to in this work, the process of telling your story is motivated by an interest in knowing and also an abiding interest to prevent anything like this happening again. So in this work, we are, to conclude, we are really, I think, in a gentle and kind way, Anne Maree tilts that big bringing them home report. She tilts it up, and it gives us a new way to look at the archive, look at the stolen generations with enormous empathy, but with a much more generous and broad lens that disrupts the dominant narrative of being stolen and the arrival of a big black car, and instead leads us to think about what choices, what agonizing choices women made in relation, to their children. So thank you very much, Anne Maree. It's my enormous pleasure to release this beautiful book into the world and for it to do its good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, for reminding us about silence as well as words, and the importance of weaving all of those elements together. Heather Goodall is with us, and it's another great pleasure of mine to be able to introduce Heather, whose childhood stomping ground I now live on and travel on here on Wongal and Bidjigal country. And those weavings of connections continue. Heather Goodall is Professor Emerita of History. And Heather has researched in three major areas, including Indigenous histories and relationships in Australia, environmental history, tracing the particular ways the environmental issues are used in gendered social conflicts and intercultural social relations, and in intercolonial networks, particularly those between Australia and India and around the Indian Ocean, including the decolonisation conflicts of the mid-20th century in India, Indonesia and Australia. Heather's worked in collaborative research projects with Aboriginal communities in New South Wales and Central Australia, and continues historical work in partnership with Tranby Cooperative and the National Indigenous Education and Training. Heather's been a historical researcher in two Royal Commissions, the Royal Commission into British nuclear testing in Australia, and also into the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Her book, Invasion to Embassy, won the 1996 New South Wales Premier's Prize for Australian History and charts a sustained focus on land in New South Wales Aboriginal politics from the 1860s to the present. Amongst the many award-winning publications that Heather has to her name, most recently she's published the co-authored Teacher for Justice, Lucy Woodcock's Transnational Life in 2020, and George's River Blues, Swamps, Mangroves and Resident Action 1945 to 1980. That's pretty exciting, our Sydney River history written up large. Until her retirement, she was a senior researcher with the Centre for Cosmopolitan Civil Societies at UTS, and she was Deputy Coordinator of the Indian Ocean South Asia Research Network. So Heather, it's a pleasure to be in your company this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. It's good to be here. And it's particularly good to be on Wongal country and to be thinking about the ways these enormously important stories are conveyed to all of us. Now, let's just see. Can you can hear me okay there? I think my internet connection might not be too stable. So if I disappear, that's what it is. I was asked by Anne Maree to talk about the broader research about child removal policies, but there are many people here, including yourself, Jen, and Heidi and others who can talk about that and have talked about it much more effectively and completely. I'm just going to talk about my research and the way it developed, because I think that gives a bit of an idea of the way so many of us failed to understand the significance of the stories that Anne Maree has been able to tell in her book. So my doctoral research started in 1975. I was interviewing Indigenous peoples in rural areas, mostly born 1900s, 1910s, sometimes a bit later. So I started off my ideas about how this research about Aboriginal history was going to occur and what it was going to involve by thinking about labour exploitation, certainly displacement from land, but racism, segregation, exclusion from schools, all those things. And the people that I was able to interview didn't want to talk about those things. They wanted to talk about their brothers and sisters, their nephews and their nieces who disappeared. They wanted to talk about their lost family members. And I hadn't understood any of that. And my early searches in 1975, 76 were the first times I'd heard about this incredible tragedy which affected the whole community. This was before the work of Link-Up and the really important First Peoples programs and campaigns to try and rebuild the linkages between the families that have been separated. And it was before the work of historians like Peter Reid and others who've tried to pull the threads of these policies together. But what those stories did and what it was that people's priorities did for me was to shift the direction of the research that I worked in, so that I came to look much more carefully at the ways in which the removal of children had shaped so many of the experiences of the whole community, not just the children who'd been taken. But I did begin to look at the sources about the child removal policy. And one of the things I was able to do in that early period was to look at the Protection Board records of wards. This was in the period before it was restricted to family members only. And I was able to do an analysis numerically. It was anonymous, but it was a numerical analysis of all the kids who'd been taken away and kept in the Protection Board structure rather than the child welfare structure, the Protection Board structure between 1912 and 1936. And what this demonstrated, this statistical analysis, what it demonstrated was that this was a gendered policy. It was Aboriginal girls at puberty who were being taken away. The way the numbers fell out in this period, from 1912 to 1921, 81% of the children removed were female, and there were only slightly less through until 1936. Girls who were 12 and older, pubertal girls, made up 54% of the total number of children who were made wards of the board until 1928. That's as far as we can see ages. While boys who were 12 and older made up only 14%. So that gives you a sense of the focus of protection board attention, and the kids themselves who were bearing the most intense burden of this for their own good policy. What it reflected was two things. It reflected a gap in the labour market. The Aborigines Protection Board was able to extract these kids, and they were able to be employed in indentured conditions as domestic servants because there was a gap in the market, because young white women were moving into factory work and extracting themselves from the incredibly exploitative domestic service that they'd previously been in. But the other dimension of this is much, much more grim. These kids were so vulnerable. They were alone, they were far from home, and they were subject to sexual abuse, to rape, and to sexual violence. Their vulnerability was even more significant than that of young white working class girls, and that was bad enough. And there's been a little bit of writing about that. Aboriginal kids were far more vulnerable and were far less protected. Very few people were prepared to speak about this, very few of the women who'd been involved. But Henry Heidi, who was a ULEI elder with whom I spoke in Brewarrina, told me in the 1970s, he said the hard part was they didn't like us after the girls. They'd come and get them and take them away, and they'd have them down there for 12 months. They'd get them into trouble, and they'd come back with white babies. That's what we were up against. That's true, that is, he said. And it was better if they left them with their own lot to link them up that way. That's my opinion of it. And Mrs. A. Morgan, who was a Yorta woman from Cummeragunja, is one of the few women who speaks about this. And she says to Melbourne Radio in 1934, of course, one of the functions, she says, of the Aborigines Protection Board is to build a white Australia. This was a horrifying policy of genetic intervention, and it was focused on girls. So in many ways, it was girls who bore the brunt of this policy up until 1936. But we can see a shift in the way the culture of the dominant settler society is working. Prior to the Second World War, it's young women's sexual activity, which is regarded as a major threat and has to be controlled, both young white working class women, but particularly Aboriginal women. After the Second World War, there's a much greater focus on young men as juvenile delinquents. It's a term that begins to become current. We don't hear very much of that at all prior to the Second World War, but we do start to hear it after the Second World War. And there's a shift in attention and focus on pressure on young Aboriginal men who are regarded increasingly as a threat and who needed to be controlled. And it's those people whom we see so horrendously frequently before the social welfare and the punitive jail, the criminal justice system. Now, in those records of wards that I was able to look at, there is a consistent thread of the denigration of Aboriginal parenting. It's criticised, it's constantly regarded as negative and damaging for the children, and this was why it was important to take children away. Now, that pressure, that criticism of Aboriginal parenting most often fell onto mothers. But like many people in that period, the late 70s, the early 80s, I was looking increasingly, my research focus was increasingly on the kids who'd been taken away and their experiences. So I didn't tell the experiences of mothers, I didn't seek out mothers, And in fact, nobody volunteered their story. No mothers volunteered their story, which is what Anne Maree found in her research later on. So her book, Stolen Motherhood, is incredibly important, in my view, in bringing the stories of those women to attention, in bringing them together in a sensitive way, as well as thinking through what it meant to be a mother, to lose a child. But what I was so impressed by also, in the great privilege I had of supervising Anne Maree's PhD, which was a great delight the whole way through, was in her alertness to the courage of so many Aboriginal women who were mothers, who they didn't forget their children. They had no choice. As Heidi said, they were forced to give up children, but they didn't forget them. They followed them through. They invariably knew where they were. They kept in, they weren't able to keep in touch, but they were able to keep them in mind, to follow their careers. It was an extraordinary insight and surprise to me to realise how many mothers had been able to follow the lives of their children, even though they'd been taken far away from them. That degree of courage and strength was so impressive, and it's a great gift that Anne Maree has been able to bring so many of these stories into the public view, and that's what you'll find in Stolen Motherhood. And the work that the Healing Foundation does continues to be incredibly important, because, as Anne Maree and Heidi have both pointed out, the pain and the loss of separations for mothers, for brothers and sisters, for uncles and aunties and nieces and nephews, all of those things travel across generations. They're felt in later actions, in later decisions that people are forced to make, and in attitudes they hold. And so the work of intergenerational healing, which is carried out by First Peoples organisations like the Healing Foundation, is really important. So not only should you read this book, you should be contributing to the Healing Foundation, and I'm delighted to be able to encourage both of those things. Read the book, it's really moving and it's really important. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks very much, Heather, for those words, for reminding us of recognition, the importance of really actively looking and recognising other people's work, recognising other people's truths, and recognising gendered histories. And that's a perfect segue to go to Jo Thitchener, who's here with us this afternoon from the Healing Foundation. What a great way to be able to meet you this afternoon, to remind us to donate to the Healing Foundation, and to be able to meet a proud Gubbi woman living on Boonwurrung land, working on Wiradjuri land down there in Naarm. Jo's the team leader of the engagement and delivery team at the Healing Foundation. She's leading a team to deliver healing initiatives that aim to amplify the voices and the lived experience of stolen generation survivors and their families, to enable them to speak for themselves, tell their own stories, and to be in charge of their own healing journeys. Some of the Healing Foundation's key projects have included the COVID-19 Resilience Project, supporting stolen generations organisations in developing resources to improve social and emotional wellbeing outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Jo, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Anne Maree, for inviting me along. And thank you so much for this wonderful book that you've brought to the table. And it is a true honour to be here and hear the work that you've done to bring this together. So I would like to bring up a screen to sort of share, if that's okay, just to give you a bit of visual of some of our work. Does that come up? So I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. Thank you, Jen, for acknowledging the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where I am here in Melbourne, in Naarm. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge the elders and stolen generation survivors who share their stories with us and whose legacy and stories continue to pave the pathway for the work that we do at the Healing Foundation to continue to sort of carry on that work and find opportunities for people to find their way home. So the Healing Foundation has been around for about 11 years now. So started after Kevin Rudd made the national apology back in 2008. The Healing Foundation was brought together to sort of create opportunities for healing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we work primarily with stolen generation survivors and their families to amplify their voices, to tell their stories and share their lived experience, but to find these pathways for healing and recognising that healing is a journey and that it takes a long time for people sometimes to even start that healing journey to find their way home. We work with trauma-aware healing informed practice to make sure that we do no further harm, and it was powerful to hear that come up with you talking, Anne Maree, and also Heidi, that's obviously a forefront in our mind, that we can't continue to re-traumatise and have re-triggers for trauma for stolen generation survivors. We want to walk alongside communities to have community-led healing for what is right for place-based healing opportunities across this nation, and definitely want to continue this piece of work that is intergenerational healing. So who are the stolen generations? Again, as we've heard, thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have been forcibly removed from their families from the 1900s right through to the 1970s. You know, it's a tragic part of our history, and obviously our work and our commitment to provide opportunities for truth-telling is an important part of carrying that stolen generation story forward so that it's part of everyone's consciousness. As many as 1 in 3 Aboriginal children were removed, often taken away from home, on their way home from school, put in institutions and adopted out to non-Indigenous families. So from the 2014 and 15 census and a report that was commissioned by the Australian Institute of Health Welfare in 2018, there were 17,150 stolen generation survivors. From the census in 2018 and 19, the latest data actually shows 33,600 stolen generation survivors across this nation. So that's a significant number, and I think hearing you talk, Anne Maree, about the book and, you know, having no voice and having no choice and the shame and all of these aspects that sort of were barriers for people being able to come forward and tell their story is significant in that number and the increase of people now acknowledging and identifying and recognising that they are stolen generation survivors. We expect from the most recent census that number will increase again, because people are still trying to find their way home, still trying to find access to their records, and still finding ways to understand their own story. Significantly there too, in 2023, all stolen generation survivors will be eligible for aged care. So trauma affects the way people think. It's overwhelming. It impacts on people's ability to cope and engage and communicate and operate effectively. Fear and anxiety, impulsive behaviour, feeling sad and hopeless, confused. These are all aspects that play out in people who have trauma experiences. Intergenerational trauma, for people that don't have the opportunity to heal, then it can get passed on from mothers to daughters to granddaughters and through families from generation to generation, and creates a ripple effect within not just the families but whole communities. So the children of stolen generation survivors experience, you know, difficulties with attachment, and this is another issue that needs to be explored as part of the truth-telling and unfolding and unpacking all of the trauma that was associated with forced removal of children for the children themselves, but obviously the stories for the mothers as well, and how important that is to know and understand and feel. Feel that level of disconnection, the disappointment and shame and all of those aspects that went along with the stories that are told through stolen generation survivors. As I mentioned, we work with trauma-aware healing informed practice. Again, I heard Heidi talking about the reframing of that narrative from this deficit discourse that's been in place for such a long time. We need to shift that to, you know, acknowledge that we've got 65,000 years of strength in our culture, and we need to sort of build on healing stories that draw strength down on that culture, and see that as a wisdom, and see that as knowledge that we need to share. We need to, and obviously all of the work that we do emphasises physical, psychological, emotional and cultural safety for stolen generation survivors, their carers, their helpers, their families. And we want to be able to enable people to tell their story their way in their own time, so that they can get a sense of control and feel empowered to share their stories as part of their healing journey. So healing helps people to overcome trauma and restore well-being. It can occur obviously at an individual level, a family level and a community level. And we've had lots of healing forums across the nation over the last sort of 11 years, most recently up in the Torres Strait Islands, the Queensland Healing Strategy. We've heard people say there's no end point to healing. It's not something that you start and that you finish and you get a certificate that you are now healed. It's not like a moment of enlightenment. It's a journey, it's a process, it's a forever story, people have told us. And we know that, and people come in and out of the healing journey. Some of the COVID research that we have been doing on the impacts of COVID on stolen generation survivors has stalled a lot of people on the healing journey. It's re-triggered trauma for stolen generation survivors, and we know we're going to have to bring people back on the healing journey again. Some of the things that help people to heal are obviously the connection to culture, feeling strength in identity, providing ways to sort of strengthen communities and to understand their experiences and to honour their experiences and enable them, as I said, to sort of bring their stories forward. So these words are from Professor Helen Milroy, and some of you may have come across them before in your own explorations. Healing occurs throughout a person's life journey, as well as across generations. It can be experienced in many forms. Mostly, however, it's about renewal. Leaving behind those things that have wounded us and caused us pain. Moving forward in our journey with hope for the future, with renewed energy, strength and enthusiasm for life. Healing gives us back to ourselves, not to hide or fight anymore, but to sit still. Calm our minds, listen to the universe and allow our spirits to dance on the wind and drift into our dream time. Healing ultimately gives us back to our country, to stand once again in our rightful place, eternal and generational. Healing is not just about recovering what has been lost or repairing what has been broken. It's about embracing our life force to create a new and vibrant fabric that keeps us grounded and connected. There's a range of different healing activities that the Healing Foundation funds and supports as we work with stolen generations organisations across the country. Yarning circles, healing camps, gatherings, healing forums, cultural trips, reconnections, community education, sharing culture, ceremony, rituals and traditions, counselling and therapeutic supports are just a few. So for the Healing Foundation, our key priorities are about leading healing nationally, strengthening the capability and capacity for healing networks and leadership, contributing to successful healing, and developing healing frameworks that include programs, knowledge and evidence to create healing outcomes, and to lead a sustainable, strong and effective organisation. Earlier this year, we presented our report on Make Healing Happen to the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, in Parliament. talking about the urgency and the need for action now. It's been, you know, such a long time since the Bringing Them Home report in 1997, and there's still a long way to go to obviously meet all of the recommendations that were put forward there. So key actions that we presented to government were the need for healing for stolen generation survivors, the need for redress, and obviously there has been some movement in redress, which is a positive start in some territories, still some states to follow. The priority for healthcare for stolen generation survivors, the need to focus on ageing survivors and the fact that all will be eligible for aged care. Access to records is such a significant part of healing and enabling people to find their own truth, to find their own history, and then to pave that pathway for their own story. Developing an intergenerational healing strategy that's community-led, so that, again, communities decide what it is for them and what their healing looks like in their own communities. A Centre for Healing and National Memorial, a significantly based in Canberra as the War Memorial, a place that tells all of the history, all of the story, all of the truth-telling, recognises all of the sites of significance, all of the former institutions, all of the keeping places. They all have a story as well that's part of the collective story of this country that needs to be shared. And a healing place for people to come together to heal, and to honour and recognise all of the stolen generation survivors. We're also hoping to strengthen, healing workforces across sectors so that people understand intergenerational trauma and the need for intergenerational healing. On our website, you'll find a couple of animations that we're very proud of that tell the story of intergenerational trauma, the impacts of colonisation and what that has done for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the country. And more recently, we've launched this second video around intergenerational healing. As I mentioned, reframing the narrative to talk about what strength there is in culture, what we can do to improve social and emotional wellbeing outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families, and to tell that story and to get people engaged in what healing looks like. So I encourage you to have a look at those. As I mentioned, this sense of urgency that we need to do this now. Some of the COVID resilience yarning circles we had last year on a regular basis, often started with a moment's silence to recognise another stolen generation survivor and or descendant who has now passed away. And there's this great sense that, many survivors haven't had access to redress or repatriations or been able to sort of get the apology that they would like as well. So we know that there's more that needs to happen, and obviously, as I said, focusing on their ageing needs so that that's a culturally appropriate space for them. Last year, we developed some fact sheets specifically with that in mind, one for aged care providers, one for general practitioners, and one for dental practitioners, so that they understand, working with stolen generation survivors, that they don't re-trigger trauma in asking the same questions over and over again. As I talked about, we're also hoping to get priority access cards like Veterans Gold cards for survivors, so that again, they get that priority treatment that they deserve. On our website, we've got this interactive map of former stolen generations institutions around the country. So you can see there the number of many of the institutions, and you can click on each of those and then sort of hone in on each location and get further information and data. That's been a work in progress for many years and is updated as more information comes to light and to hand to us. So again, feel free to have a look at that in your own time. We've also developed a schools resource kit as a way to teach future generations the stories of stolen generation survivors in a culturally appropriate, age-appropriate way. We've already developed foundation years through to year 9, and they're available on our website, and in the moment we're testing years 10, 11 and 12, and hopefully next year they'll also be on our website. and a great take up from schools, which is also encouraging that people are joining in on that reconciliation journey themselves and finding out more. And obviously we invite them to invite stolen generation survivors to tell their stories their own way at their schools where they can. So that's kind of it for me now. If you'd like to get involved, you know, make healing happen, we encourage you to have a look at our website. You know, we're really proud of all of the resources that we've got there, and we're always adding to that suite of resources to help change the narrative, to help inform everybody about stolen generation survivors, and more importantly, what needs to be done to create opportunities for intergenerational healing. We encourage you all to be champions, be advocates, to be a voice for change, to share the stories, share the understanding, to challenge and question and ask, and be part of that truth-telling process as well. And that's it. And there are social media handles there for you for Facebook, Healing Foundation, Healing Our Way for Twitter and Insta, and healingfoundation.org.au is our website. And my email is jo@healingfoundation.org.au. So you're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions, queries, thoughts, you know, comments for information down the track. So thank you again so much, Anne Maree, for inviting me along to share a little bit about our work. And I hope I haven't gone on too long there. Thank you.
Not at all, Jo. That was fantastic. Thank you very much for healing and sharing about your great work. I think you just reinforced to me that matter of healing and recognizing the importance of recognition in healing. So everybody's here and everybody's been listening carefully. And I wonder if it's a time now, after you think so carefully about what Jo's told us about that great work, and if you haven't made a donation to the Healing Foundation yet, if you perhaps wanted to follow that link, to go and make an instant contribution right now to the excellent work of the Healing Foundation. But we've got some time now. If anybody would like to ask a question of Anne Maree or of any of the panelists, if you can use your raise your hand button on your Zoom there, we can take some questions. I want to ask Fran Grant to ask her question. Thanks, Fran.
Thanks, Jen. I really wanted to thank Anne Maree for the work that she's done. I'm really looking forward to looking to the book. Anne Maree and I have only recently become great friends, and I consider Anne Maree to be one of my family now. I spoke to Anne Maree one day after a work meeting and asked her about what she had been studying and what she had been working on, and she explained to me that she was looking at mothers and the stolen generation. To give some insight, I'm the child of a stolen child. My dad was born in 1936 in Nowra. He was stolen around about 1945, and not on his way to school but from school. My understanding that the police came in and took him and other children on the day. And he was taken to Kinchela. He was about 10 at that time and spent 6 years at Kinchela in an absolute hellhole that, you know, as many of us know, that treated those young boys so disgracefully, and they went through, you know, a life of horror. So my nana, Alma Frances Dixon, gave birth to 6 boys, and of the 6 boys she gave birth to, she lost 5 to the stolen generation. And 3 of her boys, including my dad, were taken to Kinchela, and the other 2 boys were taken by family to country Victoria to be hidden, where there was less chance of them being stolen. The consequences of being part of that horrific time were that for my uncles, Uncle Kevin and Uncle Noel, who were taken to Victoria. They never spoke of being Aboriginal. I suspect they weren't told they were Aboriginal when they were little, and that was in some way to protect them. They spent all of their life believing that my Nana did not want them, and they never understood that she made the supreme sacrifice of giving them away, so that they could avoid the terror that my dad, who was a little bit older than them, was already in the midst of. While my dad was at Kinchela, my Nana gave birth to 2 more boys. Both of them were taken as very young children, taken to Wiradjuri and then on to Kinchela. Again, Uncle Edward and Uncle Graham spent their whole life believing that my Nana did not want them. And Uncle Graham, who was the baby of the family, spent the best part of his life incarcerated. He misbehaved terribly at Kinchela, hoping that that would be a way that he could get out of there, but it just made them be more cruel to him. He was adopted for a short period of time by a very sadistic family, so nothing improved for him being adopted. He spent most of his adult life in and out of jail, and in the early 1990s, he died at Long Bay Jail, and he's listed as a death in custody. My dad could leave Kinchela when he was 16. You could leave there if you had a job, and I don't know how you could get a job, but he got a job in Sydney as a painter and decorator. So he got back as far as Sydney, and he wasn't allowed to live with his extended family who lived at La Perouse. He had to live in a boarding home in the inner west. And from the documentation that I have received, it seems that he found a way to slowly move away from that boarding house and spend more time at La Perouse and reconnect with his mum, his aunties, his cousins, and so many of his family, and eventually be able to get back to the South Coast, which was his country. So I think from talking to Anne Maree, it gave me a very different perspective on my Nana and her trauma, her experiences, what it must have been like to lose 5 children. And I absolutely acknowledge that my story is a story that is a very similar story to so many families around Australia. I think Anne Maree pointed this out to me, but a very ironic part of all of this is that a number of my dad's brothers had different fathers. I guess that happened at that time, but my dad's stepfather and the name that he took, he brought some children to the marriage with my Nana, and my Nana was allowed to bring those boys up, and they were all Aboriginal as well, but she wasn't allowed to bring up the boys that she gave birth to. So I certainly think my Nana was a very strong lady. She died quite young. She died when she was 44, and I suspect that she died after many years of pining for her children. And my dad died 40 years ago. So I've spent a very long pitch of time trying to put together back my family puzzle. And right at this moment, I would like to acknowledge someone who is on this call tonight, Mary, who's my search angel, who has been helping me to fill the void that has been left by being the child of a stolen child. And I can't thank Mary enough for helping me to understand that I am connected to everyone on the South Coast, including the kings and queens that were given those labels by non-Indigenous people in that space. And we're not there yet. We're looking for my dad's birth father, but gosh, we're getting closer. And in the process of getting closer, I've learnt so much more about my dad's family and about my Nana's family, my great-grandpa's family, and what it might have been like living in that era and what happened when colonisation happened. So I really want to thank you, Anne Maree, and thank you to everyone who's made the effort to be with Anne Maree tonight. I think her work is amazing. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Fran, and it's been a great honour and privilege to meet you and become your friend over the last 6 months or so, and thank you so much for sharing that beautiful and very powerful and sad story about your family's experience. And I did just want to add to what Fran said, and it was something that I identified through my research that Fran touched on, that many Aboriginal mothers, you know, when we hear these stories that children were removed because the parents were, you know, neglectful, there's a number of instances that I identified through my research where welfare authorities would remove children of mixed Aboriginal and white ancestry and leave Aboriginal children behind. And to me, this just really highlights the racist nature of child removals, because if they believed the children were being neglected, they would have taken all the children. And so I think it really highlights the racial discrimination of child removals at this time.
Mm. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, Fran, for giving us an opportunity to sit with the story and to listen carefully and bear witness to history unfolding. And thanks, Mary, for being here as well. Brooke Otley, you had your hand up and now you've gone. Are you still?
I did. I can. Yeah. I just put it down because I noticed we were coming to the end of the session.
We might have a moment, Anne Maree.
I just had a quick comment, which was that, yeah, I thought that Heather's comment earlier or description of the Aboriginal mothers of stolen children as courageous is really apt, because I imagine that choosing to contact their children in those circumstances would have carried a huge risk of losing contact altogether, and I think that's really bold of them to have done that. And you know, while my family wasn't, my direct family wasn't stolen, I suspect that they may have avoided being stolen by hiding or denying their Aboriginal heritage at the time. For example, by you know, my great-grandmother choosing not to teach her language to any of her children. And you know, this is just one of the many impacts I'm guessing would be covered in Anne Maree's books and so many other books that are brought about by the policies that drove that brought about the stolen generation. So I think it's really important. And yeah, I'll be sharing this book with my family as well.
Mm.
It's lovely to see you, Brooke. Brooke's one of my former students, and I'm delighted she's joining us from Darwin. And I think it's really true what you say, Brooke. And one of the things that people don't realise is that, you know, so-called Aboriginal protection legislation actually, there were so many different laws and aspects to it. You know, communication between parents and children was made illegal. You know, parents were prohibited from interfering with welfare officers conducting child removals. You know, the difficulties imposed on visiting children in homes, and yet still, you know, people managed to maintain contact and keep track. And it's quite phenomenal, really, when we consider the barriers that were put in their way and the initiative that families showed to try their best to stay in touch in some way, shape or form. So thanks very much for highlighting that issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Look, it's 6:30, and I just want to say my biggest thank you, Mandangawu, to everybody who's come together this evening. It's certainly been my privilege to spend good time in fine company at this marvellous and important event, and to have the opportunity to support the Healing Foundation to do healing, and to remind us all to take good care of ourselves as we leave this evening, to think about the healing and the care that we should take for each other. But I think, Anne Maree, this is your book launch. Congratulations, you excellent person. And I think the last word should go to you.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm more than happy to hang online and chat to people, but I know some people have to go, so I do just want to say a few words so I can let people leave without feeling that they're, abandoning ship. So I just want to really sincerely thank everyone who's attended today for their interest in the topic and your comments, questions, and other contributions to our discussion of these important issues. A heartfelt thank you to Jennifer, Heidi, Heather and Joe for agreeing to be part of my book launch and for lending their wisdom and expertise to enrich our understanding of this important topic. Heather was also my PhD supervisor, as a number of us have mentioned, and I owe her a huge debt of gratitude for her rare combination of intellectual vigour and incredible kindness. And I don't think many people have both those things, but Heather has them in spades. So I never would have had the confidence to tackle this project without her support. Many of my other UTS colleagues are in attendance and have supported me in so many different ways. I've acknowledged, I hope all of you in the book, no doubt I've left someone out and I'll be in trouble, but I hope not. And love and thanks to you all, you know who you are, I won't list you all now. I want to thank the Healing Foundation through Joe for agreeing to be my nominated charity, and I hope you'll all continue to generously support the Foundation's important work with stolen generation survivors, families and communities. I wanted to acknowledge Therese Apollonio and Amy Thomas, who've been providing the behind-the-scenes support for the launch. Events like this take a lot of organising, and Therese in particular was very generous in providing advice and assistance based on her extensive event management experience, so thanks Therese. A very heartfelt thanks to all the people who gave permission to me to include content from their stories, often about highly traumatic personal experiences, in my book. And I hope the book has done some degree of justice to their stories. I also wanted to give a shout out to the Oral History and Indigenous program staff at the National Library of Australia, who put a lot of effort into obtaining permission from interviewees for me to use their material. I wanted to thank Becca Bura and Carter Morgan from Lexington Books for all their support in taking the book from thesis to publication. And gratitude and thanks to Michael Cook for allowing me to use his beautiful and very sad image, Mother Pram, as the cover of my book. I just felt it perfectly captured the themes of stolen motherhood. For all my friends from all around the world who've made the effort to be here today, including some of my friends in the UK who've had to get up very early, my lovely sister who's zooming in from regional New South Wales, and to my family, Kevin and my two beautiful now young adult children who've been on this decade-long journey with me and have provided me with so much love, support and encouragement along the way. And last but not least, I mentioned Auntie Joan, my dear friend and former colleague, retired elder in residence at UTS. And I mentioned she first suggested the idea of the stolen mums for me, and this book is dedicated to her. So love and hugs to Auntie Joan. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm happy to hang around if anyone wants to chat, but I'll let everybody go who needs to go. And I really appreciate you all so much for coming along. Thank you.